Vain bikers mock an elderly farmer. Moments later, they're fleeing in fear. The sun was high in the sky, casting a golden glow over the rolling fields of Walter's farm. The crops swayed gently in the breeze, and the faint hum of cicadas filled the air. Walter, dressed in his usual denim overalls and wide-brimmed straw hat, worked steadily. His hands, weathered and strong from decades of labor, moved with practiced ease as he fixed a broken fence post at the edge of his property. Walter had lived on this farm his entire life. The land had been in his family for generations, and he had spent every day tending to it with quiet dedication. Though his back had grown a little stooped and his pace a little slower with age, Walter took pride in his work. The farm was his legacy, and he wasn't about to let anything tarnish it. The distant roar of engines broke the serene atmosphere, growing louder with each passing second. Walter straightened, his eyes narrowing as he looked down the dirt road that ran alongside his property. A group of motorcycles appeared over the hill, the sunlight glinting off their polished chrome. The riders, clad in leather jackets and bandanas, laughed and shouted as they sped toward the small gas station near the edge of town. Walter shook his head and returned to his work. He'd seen their kind before, rowdy, restless, and always looking for trouble. It wasn't his business, and he intended to keep it that way. The bikers pulled into the gas station with a screech of tires, their loud voices disturbing the quiet town. Mason, their leader, swung off his bike with a cocky grin. His jacket was adorned with patches, each one telling a story of rebellion and defiance. The gang followed his lead, lighting cigarettes and cracking jokes as they leaned against their bikes. "This place is a ghost town," Mason said, looking around with disdain. "Where's the fun in that?" One of the bikers, a wiry man named Tex, pointed toward Walter's farm. "Look at that old-timer over there, working his fields like it's the 1800s. What do you say we go introduce ourselves?" Mason's grin widened. "Now you're talking. Let's go see if the old man's got any stories to share." The group laughed as they mounted their bikes and roared toward the farm. Walter heard them coming long before they arrived, their engines disrupting the peaceful rhythm of the countryside. He set down his tools and turned to face them, his expression calm but watchful. The bikers skidded to a stop just outside the fence, their laughter echoing in the air. Mason dismounted first, striding toward Walter with exaggerated confidence. Well, Mason said, his voice dripping with mockery. "What do we have here? The last cowboy in town?" The others laughed, crowding closer as they surveyed the old farmer. Walter met Mason's gaze, his blue eyes steady and unflinching. "This is private property," he said evenly. "You'd best be moving along." Mason feigned surprise, holding up his hands. "Whoa there, pups. No need to get hostile. We're just here to chat." Walter's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned back to his fence post and resumed his work, ignoring the bikers entirely. His silence only seemed to encourage them. Tex leaned against the fence, his grin smug. "You think you're too good to talk to us, old man? Or are you just scared?" Walter didn't look up. "I've got work to do. Don't have time for nonsense." Mason's grin faltered slightly, his pride pricked by Walter's dismissive tone. He stepped closer, kicking at the dirt. "What's the point? You think anyone cares about this rundown patch of land?" Walter paused, his hammer poised in midair. Slowly, he turned to face Mason, his gaze piercing. "This land's been feeding people longer than you've been alive. It'll outlast you too, if I have anything to say about it." Mason's smirk returned, but there was an edge to it now. Big words for a guy who probably can't even lift that hammer without throwing out his back. The gang erupted into laughter, and Mason, emboldened, reached for the tool belt hanging off the fence. "Let's see if this antique farmer's tools are as outdated as he is." Walter's hand shot out, grabbing Mason's wrist with surprising speed and strength. The gang fell silent, their laughter dying in their throats as they watched the old man hold Mason in place with ease. "I said leave," Walter said, his voice low and firm. "That's your last warning." Mason yanked his hand free, his face flushing with anger. "Or what? You gonna call the sheriff? Good luck with that. Bet it takes them an hour just to get here." Walter didn't respond. Instead, he turned back to his work, his calm demeanor unshaken. Mason glared at him, his fists clenching. "Let's see how calm you are when your precious farm isn't so perfect anymore." The bikers whooped and hollered as Mason grabbed a piece of scrap metal from the ground and hurled it into the field, crushing a row of young plants. Walter froze, his hands tightening around the hammer in his grip. He took a slow, deep breath before setting the tool down carefully. "You've gone too far," he said, his voice cold as steel. "Leave now while you still can." Mason laughed, his bravado returning. "And what are you gonna do about it, old man? Teach me a lesson?" Walter turned to face him fully, his weathered face unreadable. "Something like that?" The bikers jeered, urging Mason on as he stepped closer to Walter, but the tension in the air was palpable. Mason reached out to shove Walter, but before his hand could make contact, Walter sidestepped with surprising agility, sending Mason stumbling forward. The gang's laughter faltered as they watched their leader recover, his face a mixture of embarrassment and fury. "You think you're clever, huh?" Mason growled, lunging at Walter again. This time, Walter didn't move. Instead, he stood his ground, his expression calm and unbothered. Mason stopped short, unnerved by the old man's unshakable composure. "You boys have no idea what you've gotten yourselves into," Walter said, his voice quiet but firm. "But you're about to find out?" The bikers stood frozen for a moment, taken aback by Walter's calm warning. Mason glanced over his shoulder at his gang, his pride unwilling to let him back down. He took a step closer to Walter, squaring his shoulders in a show of defiance. "You've got a lot of nerve, old man," Mason sneered. "You think a guy like you can scare us?" Walter didn't respond. Instead, he bent down, picked up the hammer he had been using, and drove a nail into the fence post with a single, decisive blow. The sound of metal striking wood echoed in the stillness, and the bikers exchanged uncertain glances. Walter straightened and fixed his gaze on Mason, his silence more unnerving than any threat. "Come on, Mason," one of the bikers, a younger man named Duke, muttered. "Maybe we should just head out?" Mason shot him a glare. "What's the matter? You scared of a guy who probably needs a walker to get around?" The gang laughed nervously, but their bravado was starting to crack. Walter's unflinching composure and the quiet confidence in his movements were unsettling in a way they couldn't explain. "Let's show him what happens when you mess with us," Mason said, turning back to Walter. He grabbed a rock from the ground and tossed it toward the barn, where it clattered against the wooden siding. "How's that for a warning shot?" Walter's expression didn't change, but his voice dropped to a tone that sent chills down their spines. "You're making a mistake." Mason smirked, but the slight quiver in his hand betrayed his uncertainty. "Oh yeah? What are you gonna do about it?" Without a word, Walter stepped toward the barn. The bikers watched him warily, unsure of his intentions. When he disappeared around the corner, Mason let out a short laugh. "Guess he's running to hide." "Figures." The gang chuckled, but their laughter was cut short by a sudden, loud bang from inside the barn. The noise was followed by the low growl of an engine. The bikers turned to each other, confusion and unease etched on their faces. "What the hell was that?" Tex muttered. Before anyone could respond, the barn doors swung open with a dramatic creak, and Walter emerged, seated on an old but powerful tractor. The machine roared to life, its massive wheels churning up dust as it rolled toward the bikers. Mason's cocky grin faltered as Walter brought the tractor to a stop a few feet away. He climbed down with surprising ease, holding a thick length of chain in one hand. The sunlight glinted off the metal, and the bikers took an involuntary step back. "You've had your fun," Walter said, his voice steady and firm. "Now it's my turn." The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, but Mason forced a laugh, trying to regain control of the situation. "What's that for, old man? You gonna tie us up?" Walter didn't answer. Instead, he looped the chain around the fence post, securing it tightly. With a quick movement, he attached the other end to the tractor. The bikers watched in confusion as Walter climbed back into the driver's seat and revved the engine. The tractor lurched forward, pulling the fence post from the ground with a groan of protest. Walter stopped the tractor and climbed down, lifting the post with ease and planting it firmly in a new hole he had prepared earlier. The effortless display of strength left the bikers speechless. "You see this land?" Walter said, gesturing to the fields around him. "I've worked it with my own hands every day of my life. You think a bunch of loudmouth punks like you can scare me off it?" The bikers shuffled uncomfortably, the weight of Walter's words sinking in. Mason, however, refused to back down. He stepped forward, his fists clenched. "You think you're tough because you can move some wood? Let's see how tough you are without that tractor." Walter sighed, shaking his head. "I warned you." Before Mason could respond, Walter reached into the pocket of his overalls and pulled out a small whistle. He brought it to his lips and blew a sharp, piercing note that echoed across the farm. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, from the fields, the sound of thundering hooves filled the air. The bikers turned, their eyes widening in shock as a group of horses galloped toward them, their powerful forms kicking up a cloud of dust. Leading the charge was a massive black stallion, its mane flying like a banner in the wind. Walter stood calmly as the horses slowed to a halt, circling him protectively. "Meet my helpers," Walter said, his tone casual. "They don't take kindly to strangers who don't respect their home." The bikers stumbled back, their bravado crumbling in the face of the imposing animals. Mason tried to maintain his composure, but his voice shook as he barked orders to his gang. "Get back to the bikes. Let's go." The gang scrambled to their motorcycles, tripping over each other in their haste to escape. Walter watched silently as they fumbled with their keys, the horses standing motionless at his side. As Mason started his engine, he cast one last glare at Walter. "You got lucky today, old man. But we'll be back." Walter took a step forward, his blue eyes cold. "If you come back, you won't leave so easily." The threat hung in the air, and Mason hesitated for a moment before revving his engine and speeding away. The rest of the gang followed, their laughter replaced by the roar of their bikes as they disappeared down the road. Walter turned to the horses, patting the stallion on the neck. "Good work, Midnight. Let's get back to it." The horses trotted back to the barn, and Walter returned to his work as if nothing had happened. The quiet of the farm settled around him once more, the bikers' intrusion already fading into memory. The sound of the bikers' engines faded into the distance, leaving Walter alone with his land. The horses had already returned to their grazing, their calm presence a stark contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. Walter picked up his tools and went back to fixing the fence, his expression as stoic as ever. Meanwhile, Mason and his gang rode back to the town's gas station, their silence heavy with unspoken frustration and embarrassment. Mason slammed his helmet onto his handlebars, his face flushed with anger. The gang dismounted one by one, avoiding eye contact as they gathered near the pumps. "What the hell just happened back there?" Tex finally asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "Did we seriously just let an old man chase us off his farm?" Mason scowled, running a hand through his hair. "He didn't chase us off. We left because we had better things to do." Duke snorted, crossing his arms. "Yeah, sure. That's why we bolted like a bunch of scared kids." The tension among the group was palpable. Mason glared at Duke, his jaw tightening. "You want to go back and handle it yourself, tough guy? Be my guest." Duke looked away, muttering under his breath. None of them were eager to return to the farm, not after what they had seen. Walter's calm demeanor and unexpected strength had shaken them, and the memory of the horses charging toward them still lingered in their minds. One of the older bikers, Jack, spoke up, his voice measured. "Look, we had our fun, but maybe we should let it go. That farmer's tougher than he looks, and we've got nothing to prove by messing with him again." Mason shot him a sharp look. "Let it go? Are you kidding me? He made us look like fools." Jack shrugged. "Better to walk away with our pride than go back and risk looking even worse." Mason clenched his fists, his pride warring with his common sense. He hated the idea of backing down, but deep down, he knew Jack was right. Walter wasn't someone to be underestimated, and the gang had already pushed their luck. "Fine," Mason said through gritted teeth. "We'll let it go. But if that old man thinks he's won, he's dead wrong." The gang murmured their agreement, though none of them seemed eager to test Walter's patience again. Back at the farm, Walter finished his repairs and stood back to admire his work. The fence was sturdy once more, and the fields were quiet, save for the rustling of the crops in the breeze. He wiped the sweat from his brow and headed toward the barn, where the horses were waiting for their evening feed. As he worked, the familiar sound of footsteps approached from behind. Walter turned to see his neighbor, Sam, standing at the edge of the barn. Sam was a wiry man in his late 60s, with a weathered face and a kind smile. He tipped his hat in greeting. "Evening, Walter," Sam said. "Heard there was some commotion out this way. Everything all right?" Walter nodded, his expression calm. "Just a bunch of rowdy bikers. They thought they could stir up trouble." Sam chuckled, leaning against the barn door. "And let me guess, you sent them packing?" Walter shrugged, his tone modest. "Did what needed to be done. Nothing more." Sam shook his head, a grin spreading across his face. "You've always been a tough one, Walter. I'd pay good money to see the look on those punks' faces when they realized they'd messed with the wrong man." Walter's lips twitched in a faint smile. "They won't be back. Not after today." Sam nodded, his admiration evident. "Well, if you need anything, you just holler. The whole town's got your back, you know." "Appreciate it," Walter said, tipping his hat. "But I think I've got it handled." Sam laughed and headed back toward his own property, leaving Walter to finish his chores in peace. Despite Mason's declaration that they would let the matter go, the events of that day continued to weigh heavily on him. His pride had taken a serious hit, and the memory of Walter's quiet strength gnawed at him. He spent the next few days brooding, replaying the encounter in his mind and trying to convince himself that it hadn't been a complete humiliation. One evening, as the gang gathered at a local bar, Mason finally broke his silence. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low but firm. "We can't just let that old man get away with making us look like idiots." Tex frowned, setting down his beer. "You said we were letting it go." "I changed my mind," Mason snapped. "We need to show him who's in charge. If we don't, we'll be the laughingstock of this whole town." Jack sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Mason, this is a bad idea. That farmer's not someone you want to mess with." Mason glared at him. "He's just an old man. We were caught off guard last time, that's all. If we go back and hit him where it hurts, he won't be so high and mighty." The gang exchanged uneasy glances, but Mason's stubbornness left them with little choice. Reluctantly, they agreed to follow his lead. That night, under the cover of darkness, the bikers rode back to Walter's farm. Their engines were silent as they approached, their headlights dimmed to avoid detection. Mason led the way, his jaw set and his determination unwavering. They parked their bikes at the edge of the property and crept toward the barn, their movements cautious and deliberate. Mason gestured for Tex and Duke to follow him while the others spread out to cover more ground. Walter, however, was already aware of their presence. He had been sitting on the porch, enjoying a quiet evening, when he spotted the faint glint of metal in the moonlight. His eyes narrowed, and he stood, moving with the quiet precision of a man who knew his land better than anyone. As the bikers approached the barn, they found the doors slightly ajar. Mason motioned for the others to stay back as he stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The barn was empty, save for a few tools and stacks of hay. Mason frowned, his frustration mounting. "Where is he?" he muttered. Before anyone could answer, a loud bang echoed through the air, followed by the sudden roar of the tractor engine. The bikers spun around, their flashlights darting wildly. The sound was coming from the far end of the field, where the silhouette of the tractor loomed against the night sky. "Let's go!" Mason barked, leading the charge toward the noise. But as they neared the tractor, they found themselves stumbling over tripwires cleverly hidden in the grass. Tex let out a yelp as he fell, landing face-first in the dirt. Duke tripped soon after, cursing loudly as he tried to untangle himself. The remaining bikers slowed, their nerves fraying with each passing second. Walter's voice cut through the darkness, calm and steady. "You boys never learn, do you?" Mason whipped around, his flashlight searching for the source of the voice. "Show yourself, old man." Walter stepped into the beam of light, his expression unreadable. He held a lantern in one hand and a length of rope in the other. "You came looking for trouble. Now you found it?" The bikers froze, their bravado evaporating as they took in Walter's calm, imposing presence. The sound of hoofbeats echoed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Walter smiled faintly, the expression sending a chill down their spines. "Midnight and the others are restless tonight," Walter said. "I suggest you leave before they decide to stretch their legs." The bikers hesitated, their courage wavering. Mason glared at Walter, his fists clenched, but the faint sound of snorting horses made him rethink his next move. "Fine," Mason spat, his voice shaking. "We're leaving." The bikers scrambled back to their bikes, their retreat far less dignified than their arrival. Walter watched them go, his lantern casting a warm glow in the cool night air. Once the roar of their engines faded, he turned and walked back to the porch, his calm demeanor unshaken. As he settled into his chair, the horses trotted back to the barn, their mission complete. Walter smiled to himself, his gaze sweeping over the quiet fields. The farm was safe once more, and he knew the bikers wouldn't dare return. Walter's porch light flickered in the cool breeze as he leaned back in his wooden chair, the calm of the night returning after the bikers' hurried retreat. The scent of fresh-cut hay mixed with the earthy aroma of his fields. Midnight, his loyal stallion, wandered close to the fence, huffing softly before returning to the barn. Walter sipped his coffee, the steam curling up into the night air, and allowed himself a rare smile. He knew one thing for sure, those bikers wouldn't be coming back anytime soon. But Walter underestimated just how far a man like Mason was willing to go to save face. Back at the local bar, the gang was drowning their humiliation in cheap beer and even cheaper excuses. Mason slammed his mug onto the sticky counter, his eyes burning with anger. His pride, bruised beyond recognition, demanded satisfaction. "We can't let him get away with this," Mason roared, his voice echoing in the nearly empty room. The gang, still shaken, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Tex glanced at Duke, who shrugged, both clearly uncertain about going back. "Mason," Jack began, his tone cautious, "we already tried twice. The guy's no ordinary farmer. He's smart, and he knows that land like the back of his hand. Maybe we just let it go." "Let it go?" Mason snapped, standing so suddenly that his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Do you hear yourself? We're a gang, not a bunch of cowards who run from an old man with a tractor." Tex, emboldened by Mason's outburst, leaned forward. "What's your plan then, boss? We've already been outsmarted twice." Mason grinned, a cold and calculating expression that sent a chill through the group. "We don't play by his rules anymore. If he wants to fight dirty, then so will we." The gang exchanged uneasy glances but knew better than to challenge Mason when he was in this state. Whatever he had planned, it wouldn't end well, for anyone. The next morning, Walter rose early as he always did, with the sun just cresting over the hills. The world was quiet, the kind of stillness that only existed in the hours before the day truly began. Walter fed the horses, checked the chicken coop, and started repairing an old wagon wheel. His routine was a comforting rhythm, one that had carried him through decades of hard work. He was halfway through his repairs when he noticed the faint smell of smoke. Walter's brow furrowed as he looked toward the horizon, where a thin column of black smoke was rising from the direction of the fields. His heart sank. Setting down his tools, he grabbed a bucket and sprinted toward the source. What he saw made his blood boil. A section of his wheat field was ablaze, the golden stalks crackling and hissing as the fire consumed them. Walter didn't hesitate. He ran to the nearby water pump, filled his bucket, and began dousing the flames. The fire was small, likely started with a match or lighter fluid, and he managed to put it out quickly. As he stood there, catching his breath, his eyes scanned the area. Tire tracks in the dirt led away from the field, their pattern unmistakably belonging to motorcycles. "Mason." Walter clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. This wasn't just a prank anymore. It was an attack on his livelihood, on the land his family had nurtured for generations. He wasn't going to let them get away with it. That afternoon, Walter drove into town in his old pickup truck, the engine rumbling softly as he pulled into the gas station. The locals greeted him with nods and friendly waves, their respect for him evident in every interaction. Walter approached Sam, who was leaning against the counter inside the small convenience store. "Sam," Walter said, his tone serious. "I need a favor." Sam straightened, sensing the urgency in Walter's voice. "What do you need?" "I need to know where those bikers are staying," Walter replied. "The ones that have been causing trouble." Sam hesitated, glancing around the store to make sure no one else was listening. "They've been hanging out at the old warehouse on the edge of town." "Why?" Walter's eyes hardened. "They crossed a line. Burned part of my field this morning." Sam's expression darkened. "That's low even for them. You want me to call the sheriff?" "No," Walter said firmly. "I'll handle it myself." Sam opened his mouth to argue but stopped when he saw the determination in Walter's eyes. He nodded slowly. "All right, just be careful." Walter tipped his hat and left without another word, the weight of his decision pressing heavily on his shoulders. He didn't want trouble, but he couldn't stand by while his land was threatened. As dusk settled over the town, Walter drove toward the old warehouse, his truck blending into the shadows of the evening. He parked a safe distance away and approached on foot, his movements quiet and deliberate. The warehouse was dimly lit, with the sound of laughter and the occasional clink of bottles coming from inside. Walter circled the building, taking note of the motorcycles parked out front and the layout of the area. He didn't plan to confront them directly, not yet. Instead, he began setting up small traps around the perimeter. Tripwires made from fishing line, cans filled with rocks that would rattle loudly when disturbed, and a few strategically placed boards with nails sticking out. When he was satisfied, Walter retreated to a safe vantage point and waited. It didn't take long for the bikers to stumble into his traps. The sound of cursing and crashing filled the air as Tex tripped over a wire, sending a stack of empty barrels tumbling to the ground. Another biker stepped on one of the nailed boards, yelping in pain as he hopped away. "What the hell is going on out here?" Mason bellowed, storming out of the warehouse. He looked around, his face red with anger as he spotted the makeshift traps. "It's him," he growled. "The old man." The gang scrambled to their bikes, determined to catch Walter, but the traps had already delayed them enough to give him a head start. Walter climbed into his truck and drove back toward his farm, his mind racing. He knew they would come after him, but that was exactly what he wanted. The bikers arrived at the farm under the cover of darkness, their headlights cutting through the night. Mason led the way, his jaw set and his fists clenched. They parked their bikes at the edge of the property and spread out, their flashlights sweeping across the fields. "Spread out," Mason ordered. "Find him." But Walter was ready. He had spent the past few hours preparing his land, using every trick he had learned over a lifetime of farming. As the bikers ventured deeper onto the property, they found themselves disoriented. Fences seemed to appear out of nowhere, herding them into narrow paths. Holes had been carefully dug and covered, causing several bikers to stumble and fall. The horses, sensing the tension, began to stir in the barn. Midnight let out a loud, commanding whinny that echoed across the farm. The bikers hesitated, their confidence faltering. "Keep moving," Mason barked, though even he seemed less sure of himself. Suddenly, the lights in the barn flickered on, illuminating Walter as he stood in the center of the doorway. In his hands was a pitchfork, its sharp tines glinting in the light. His expression was calm but unyielding. "You boys don't learn, do you?" Walter said, his voice carrying easily over the distance. Mason took a step forward, his bravado barely holding. "You think you can scare us with some traps and a pitchfork?" Walter smiled faintly, but there was no humor in it. "I don't need to scare you. You've done that to yourselves." At that moment, Midnight and the other horses burst out of the barn, their powerful forms charging straight toward the bikers. The gang scattered, their shouts of panic filling the air as they scrambled to avoid the stampede. Mason tripped and fell, his flashlight skittering out of his hand. Walter approached slowly, the pitchfork still in his grip. He stopped a few feet away from Mason, towering over him despite his age. "This is my land," Walter said, his voice low and firm. "You come here again, and you'll leave with more than just bruised egos." Mason scrambled to his feet, his face pale. "You're crazy," he muttered, backing away. Walter didn't respond. He simply watched as Mason and the rest of the gang fled to their bikes, their pride shattered and their resolve broken. The roar of their engines faded into the distance, leaving the farm in silence once more. Walter turned to Midnight, patting the stallion's neck. "Good work, boy. Let's get some rest." As he walked back to the house, the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. The farm, battered but unbroken, stood as a testament to Walter's resilience. And though the bikers might have thought they were invincible, they would never forget the lesson they learned that night. As the sun rose over the farm the next morning, Walter stood on his porch, sipping his coffee. The events of the previous night had left the land quiet again, though signs of the bikers' chaos lingered. Trampled crops and tire tracks marked the places where they had tried, and failed, to assert their dominance. Walter's gaze swept over the fields as he formulated his next steps. He knew the bikers wouldn't be back anytime soon. Men like Mason weren't the type to admit defeat, but they also weren't foolish enough to face the same humiliation twice. Still, Walter wasn't one to leave things unfinished. There were lessons to be learned here, not just for the bikers, but for the town and for himself. He spent the morning repairing the damages. With each swing of the hammer and each patch of soil replanted, he felt the land return to life under his hands. The horses grazed peacefully nearby, their calm presence a stark contrast to the chaos they had helped end the night before. Midnight trotted over to Walter, nudging his shoulder as if to check on him. "I'm fine, boy," Walter murmured, scratching the stallion's neck. "Thanks to you and the others." As he worked, Sam arrived, his truck kicking up a cloud of dust as it pulled into the driveway. He climbed out, his face a mixture of concern and admiration. "Morning, Walter," Sam called. "Heard there was some excitement out here last night." Walter set down his tools and walked over to greet him. "You could say that," he replied. "Those bikers came back like I figured they would." Sam shook his head, whistling softly. "And let me guess, you sent them running again?" Walter shrugged, his expression modest. "They won't be back. Not after the lesson they got." Sam chuckled, leaning against his truck. "You're a better man than me, Walter. I'd have called the sheriff and let him deal with it." "That's not my way," Walter said simply. "Besides, sometimes people learn better when they're taught face to face." Sam nodded, his respect for Walter evident. "Well, if you ever need backup, you know where to find me." Walter smiled faintly. "Appreciate it, Sam. But I think the worst of it is over." While the bikers may have fled the farm in fear, Mason's pride still burned. He holed up in the old warehouse with the rest of the gang, pacing back and forth as his mind raced. The memory of Walter standing in the barn doorway, calm and resolute, haunted him. He had underestimated the old man, and now his leadership was being questioned. The other bikers sat in a loose circle, nursing their bruises, both physical and emotional. Tex spoke up first, breaking the uneasy silence. "Maybe we should just cut our losses, Mason. That farmer's not worth the trouble." Mason stopped pacing, turning to glare at Texas. "You think I'm just gonna let this go? Let that old man make fools of us?" Jack sighed, his tone cautious. "Mason, we've already tried 3 times. Every time, he's outsmarted us. Maybe it's time to move on." Mason's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists. "Move on? You want us to just roll over and let him win?" "It's not about winning or losing," Jack replied. "It's about knowing when to walk away." Mason's eyes narrowed, his anger simmering just below the surface. "You can walk away if you want, Jack. But I'm not done." Jack met his gaze evenly. "Then you're on your own." The gang fell silent, the tension in the air thick. One by one, the bikers stood and walked out, leaving Mason alone in the dimly lit warehouse. His anger turned inward, and he slammed his fist against the wall. He had been abandoned not just by his gang, but by the image of power he had spent years cultivating. Back at the farm, Walter received an unexpected visitor. Clarissa, the town's mayor, arrived in her sleek sedan, stepping out in her neatly pressed suit. She approached Walter with a purposeful stride, her expression warm but serious. "Walter," she said, extending a hand. "I've been hearing about the trouble you've been dealing with. I wanted to check in." Walter shook her hand, nodding politely. "Appreciate it, Mayor. Things are under control now." Clarissa glanced toward the fields, noting the repaired fences and trampled crops. It's clear you've handled it, but this shouldn't have been your burden alone. Those bikers have been causing problems all over town, and it's time we put a stop to it." Walter raised an eyebrow. "You planning to bring in the sheriff?" "Yes," Clarissa said. "But I also think the town needs to stand together on this. You've set an example, Walter, showing that we don't have to let outsiders push us around. Now it's time for the rest of us to step up." Walter considered her words, then nodded. "If the town's willing to stand together, I'll support it." Clarissa smiled. "Thank you, Walter. Your strength and resilience have been an inspiration to all of us." As she left, Walter felt a sense of quiet pride. He hadn't sought recognition for his actions, but it felt good to know that his efforts had made a difference. A few days later, Mason found himself sitting alone at the bar, nursing a drink and staring blankly at the counter. He had lost his gang, his reputation, and his sense of purpose. The bartender, an older man with a gruff demeanor, watched him with mild curiosity. "You look like a man with a lot on his mind," the bartender said, pouring Mason another drink. Mason scoffed, his grip tightening around the glass. "You wouldn't understand." "Try me," the bartender replied, leaning on the counter. Mason hesitated, then let out a bitter laugh. "I went up against an old farmer and lost. 3 times. The bartender raised an eyebrow. "Walter?" Mason frowned. "You know him?" "Everyone in this town knows Walter," the bartender said. "He's a good man. Tough as nails, too. You're lucky he didn't do worse to you." Mason's jaw tightened. "He made a fool of me." "Maybe," the bartender said. "Or maybe he taught you something." Mason glared at him. "Like what?" The bartender shrugged. "Like the fact that being loud and brash doesn't make you strong. Real strength comes from knowing who you are and standing your ground." Mason fell silent, the bartender's words hitting closer to home than he cared to admit. Over the next few weeks, life on the farm returned to normal. The crops began to recover, the fences stood strong, and the horses grazed peacefully. Walter continued his work, his quiet determination as steadfast as ever. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a familiar sound reached his ears, the distant hum of a motorcycle engine. Walter set down his tools and walked to the edge of the property, his expression calm but alert. Mason approached slowly, his bike coming to a stop just outside the fence. He dismounted and removed his helmet, his demeanor subdued. For a moment, neither man spoke. "What do you want?" Walter asked, his voice even. Mason hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I came to apologize." Walter raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. "I was out of line," Mason admitted. "I let my pride get the better of me and I made a lot of bad choices. I'm sorry for what I did, to you, to your land." Walter studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Takes a big man to admit when he's wrong." Mason looked surprised but relieved. "So, we're good?" Walter's expression softened. "We're good. Just remember, respect goes both ways. You show it, and you'll get it in return." Mason nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I'll remember." As Mason rode away, the sound of his engine fading into the night, Walter turned back to his fields. The land was quiet again, its peace restored. And though he knew challenges would always come, he also knew that the strength of his roots, and the lessons of the past, would carry him through. The days after Mason's apology were quieter than Walter had expected. It wasn't just the absence of the bikers. There was a newfound stillness around the town. People spoke of what Walter had done with admiration, and it seemed as though everyone had a story to share about him. The old farmer who had stood his ground, the man who had protected his land without resorting to violence, was now something of a local legend. Walter, however, wasn't one to revel in the attention. He kept to his work, repairing what had been damaged and preparing for the harvest season. The fields were recovering, and the horses seemed more relaxed, sensing that the threat had passed. Still, there was a lingering unease in the back of Walter's mind. Mason's apology had been sincere, but it felt incomplete, as though there was more to come. Mason, meanwhile, struggled with his own demons. The apology to Walter had lifted some of the weight from his shoulders, but it hadn't erased the shame he felt. For years, he had led his gang with bravado, convincing himself that power came from being feared. But Walter had shown him something different. Power, real power, came from respect and resilience. One evening, Mason sat alone on the edge of a hill overlooking the town. His bike was parked nearby, and the sound of crickets filled the air. He thought about the choices he had made, the people he had hurt, and the bridges he had burned. For the first time in a long time, he felt the sting of regret. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, Mason made a decision. He couldn't undo the past, but he could change the future. And he knew where to start. The next morning, Walter was in the barn tending to the horses when he heard the rumble of an engine. He stepped outside, his expression calm but watchful, as Mason rode up to the edge of the property. This time, Mason wasn't alone. Behind him were two other bikers, Tex and Jack, both looking as uneasy as Mason had the day he apologized. Walter walked toward them, his hands resting lightly on his hips. "Back again?" he asked, his tone neutral. Mason dismounted and nodded. "Yeah. I wanted to talk to you." Walter studied him for a moment, then motioned for him to speak. Mason took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about what you said, about respect. You're right. I spent years trying to take it by force, but that's not how it works. I need to earn it. And I want to start by making things right." Walter tilted his head, intrigued. "Go on." Mason gestured to the bikers behind him. "We've got hands, and we're not afraid of hard work. If you'll let us, we want to help fix what we broke." Walter raised an eyebrow. "You're offering to work the fields?" Mason nodded. "We'll do whatever needs to be done. No strings, no shortcuts. Just honest work." Walter considered the offer, his blue eyes searching Mason's face for any sign of insincerity. But what he saw was a man genuinely trying to make amends. After a long pause, he nodded. "All right, let's see what you've got." The bikers weren't used to the grueling pace of farm work, and it showed. By midday, they were drenched in sweat, their hands blistered from handling tools they'd never used before. Tex grumbled under his breath as he hauled a bale of hay, while Jack wiped his forehead and muttered something about missing his bike. Walter, however, worked alongside them without complaint. He showed them how to repair fences, tend to the crops, and care for the horses. His movements were efficient and precise, a testament to decades of experience. Though he didn't say much, his presence was steady and reassuring, and the bikers found themselves wanting to prove they could keep up. By the end of the day, the group gathered by the barn, exhausted but satisfied. Mason leaned against a fence post, his shirt soaked with sweat, and let out a weary laugh. "That was harder than I expected." Walter smirked. "Farm work isn't for the faint of heart." Mason nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I can see why you care about this place so much. It's not just land, it's life." Walter's gaze softened. "It's about more than just the land. It's about what you leave behind. The work you do today shapes tomorrow." The bikers fell silent, the weight of Walter's words sinking in. For the first time, they began to understand the depth of what they had threatened with their reckless actions. Over the next few weeks, the bikers became a regular presence on the farm. They worked hard, their efforts gradually repairing the damage they had caused. The locals took notice, and though there was initial skepticism, it wasn't long before the town began to accept them. People saw their dedication and willingness to change, and grudging respect turned into genuine admiration. Mason, in particular, seemed to thrive under Walter's guidance. He asked questions, learned quickly, and even started to show a knack for handling the horses. Midnight, who was usually wary of strangers, took a liking to him, and Mason found himself spending hours in the barn, brushing the stallion's coat and talking to him as though he were an old friend. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mason approached Walter, who was sitting on the porch with a mug of coffee. "Got a minute?" Walter gestured to the empty chair beside him. "What's on your mind?" Mason sat down, his expression serious. "I've been thinking about what's next. For me, for the gang. We can't keep doing what we were doing. It's not who I want to be anymore." Walter nodded, his gaze steady. "Change isn't easy, but it's worth it. What do you want to do?" Mason hesitated, then said, "I want to give back. Maybe help other guys like me, guys who've made mistakes and want to turn things around." Walter's lips quirked in a faint smile. "That's a good start. Mason leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "You've taught me a lot, Walter. Not just about work, but about life. I owe you for that." "You don't owe me anything," Walter said. "But if you want to pay it forward, that's the best way to honor what you've learned." Mason nodded, his resolve strengthening. "I will." Months passed, and the farm thrived under the combined efforts of Walter, Mason, and the bikers. The fields were lush and green, the fences sturdy, and the barn in better shape than it had been in years. The town, once wary of the bikers, now welcomed them as part of the community. Mason started a program for young men in the area, offering them the chance to work on the farm and learn the value of hard work. Walter supported him every step of the way, providing guidance and sharing his wisdom. Together, they created something that went beyond repairing the land. They built a foundation for a better future. One evening, as the town gathered for a harvest festival, Walter stood by the barn, watching as the bikers mingled with the locals. Mason was laughing with a group of kids, showing them how to lasso a bale of hay, while Tex and Jack helped set up tables for the feast. Clarissa approached Walter, her smile warm. "You've done something incredible here, Walter. You've shown this town what it means to stand together." Walter shook his head, his expression humble. "It wasn't just me. They did the work. All I did was give them a chance." Clarissa nodded, her admiration evident. "Sometimes, that's all people need." As the festival lights twinkled in the distance and the sound of laughter filled the air, Walter felt a deep sense of peace. The farm was more than just a place now. It was a symbol of resilience, redemption, and the power of community. For Mason and the bikers, it was a second chance. For the town, it was a reminder that strength came in many forms. And for Walter, it was the culmination of a lifetime's work, a legacy he could be proud of.